The question is, will India join an alliance, in a formal alliance with the United States? China's strategy, mistakenly so, is to needle India so India would take its line. And then you can't ignore Russia. The reason for that is, if Russia joins an alliance with China, then you have a real bipolar competition. India has a bit of a challenge that it doesn't follow through promised programs. India's biggest challenge
Yeah.
is this whole inability to use is demographic dividend and the human development very skewed. So this is what most unequal rising power in history, I would argue. India has not put enough money on education, healthcare, and infrastructure. I'm not talking about the big ticket infrastructure, rural
Hmm.
infrastructure to urban planning to whatnot.
Hello and welcome to Culture Vibes, the Federal's special program in which we talk to writers and artists about their work. What does it mean for a country to be recognized as a great power? Is it about tanks and trade surpluses, or something less tangible like influence and ideas? Few nations capture this dilemma quite like India. Despite being the world's most populous country and a rapidly growing economy, India remains on the cusp of the global elite, acknowledged by some as a rising force, but is still absent from the world's most exclusive circles. In his latest book, The Unfinished Quest, India's Search for Major Power Status from Nehru to Modi, uh, which has been published in India by Context, well known Canadian political scientist T.V. Paul dissects India's decades long pursuit to be a global power. He asks hard questions like why hasn't India, with all its assets, fully joined the ranks of great powers? How do domestic challenges and geopolitical rivalries, particularly with China, shape this journey? And what role does India's democratic identity play in its quest for global relevance? Welcome to the show, Mr. Paul. Thanks much indeed for joining me.
Thank you for having me.
So, as I said, this is a very well researched and well argued book. Uh, let me to begin with, let me ask you that, as the title itself suggests, the unfinished quest. You know, this quest is something that India has been, and you write in the book, has been on since its independence in 1947. So why do you think the major power status, as it were, remains really elusive for India even after 75 or more years of its independence?
Well, one of the key things to think about great powers or major power status, it's not automatic entry, it's a club. So
Right.
in the past, it was a racialized world order where the European powers simply arrogated themselves. Only a handful were allowed to come to this club.
Mm.
After World War II, the winners of World War II made that P5, and everybody else, including the two vanquished, Germany and Japan, were placed in a non-great power category. India became independent in 1947, missing by 2 years the formation of the UN Security Council that happened in San Francisco in 1945. Despite the fact that India provided some 2.5 million soldiers to World War II and played a big role in especially in the Eastern Theater in defeating Japan. So here the question is, how do you get there without another war? That means peaceful accommodation by the existing great powers, who during the Cold War viewed India as a kind of a spoiler because it was in the non-aligned camp and sometimes pro-Soviet, or not pro, at least tilted towards Soviet, because the Soviets helped India to survive in many ways. And so there has been a status depreciation by the Western countries. They equated India with Pakistan, the parity idea. So after the liberalization in 1991, India started picking up the economy, 6%, 7%. And today it is supposedly the fourth largest economy and soon will become third. So there are ambitions are changing. And then you have also an elite that is in charge of India, that's Mr. Modi and his party, have
Right.
explicitly stated that they want India to be a major power. And they are making some moves, but it is not easy to enter without a substantial accommodation by other peer group powers, in
Mm.
particular China. And China is not interested in another competitor in Indo-Pacific. Obviously, they are thwarting up to a point. But
Mm.
again, the idea of a major power is also changed today. The notion that you can have a sphere of influence, which is a big characteristic of a major power, a great power of the past, is very
Right.
difficult to achieve. Even China is finding it difficult. So you have to
Mm.
find other social creative ideas to enter this club. And India has joined some new organizations like Quad and G20, etc. So there are some
Mm.
moves, but it's going to be a bit of a challenge to get formal recognition just for India.
Right, right. And in what ways do you think India's strategic relationships with the United States, for instance, and the global power, then there are countries like Japan, Australia, and other Indo-Pacific nations that can act as a some sort of a counterbalance to China and its and the kind of overtures it's making in the region for that kind of hegemony in the south.
So the so-called swing power status, and that's
Yeah.
is a big part of India's strategy, as well as India's value for the powers such as the United States. But I would go back to the
Mhm.
2005 nuclear accord as a starting point
Right.
of partial accommodation by the United States, the George W. Bush administration, for strategic reasons. Condoleezza Rice, the Secretary of State, and Mr. Bush decided that India would be very useful for this purpose. But then came 9/11, and I mean, 9/11, of course, started before that. But the point is, sort of
Yeah.
uh, slow down the India's march. And secondly, India has this strategic autonomy
Mm.
notion, which means India is not willing to play exactly according to what the West or the United States wants. So there are these challenges to
Right.
that relationship. And Mr. Trump is likely to bring quite a bit of challenges for India, as he doesn't have the notion of friends or enemies. Everybody is an enemy as long as you don't provide economic
Mm.
benefits to the United States. But that doesn't mean that India's position is going to diminish, because if you look around the arc of Indian Ocean and the Indo-Pacific, there is no other power with this much capabilities
Mm.
as well as potential. This is the potential parties, especially in the area of naval power,
Right.
that it could contribute. The question
Mm.
is, will India join an alliance, in a formal alliance with the United States against China? Unlikely, because
Mm.
unless the Chinese start a war in Taiwan and then needle on India much further, creates trouble in the Indian Ocean. The Chinese are smarter than that. Their idea would be coercion, get there without a war, is Sun Tzu mode. So they will try their best to push countries to accept their logic. So in that logic, the India has to be creative. You cannot abandon the West, you cannot abandon the United States, but also is
Right.
make sure India will not be a target of China's aggression. The salami
Mm.
slicing strategy is what China has been doing, which really is what keeping India uncomfortable with China. In fact, it is a mistake on China's part to do this kind of a strategic needling
Mhm.
as they are.
Right. So, do you think that with a belligerent neighbor like China, the task is going to be much more difficult than it would have been? And you begin in the introduction itself by talking about uh, the uh, the dispute India and China have been having on the the line of actual control, and we begin with 2020 when it sort of encroached on some parts of India, and then again in 2022 in Galvan, and all these episodes you begin with. My question is that when you have a belligerent nation like China and it's widely acknowledged, do you think India's ambition is going to be much more difficult, and it would
I,
entail a lot more roadblocks than it would otherwise?
I would call it more challenging, not because their strategy is two step forward, one step backward, basically needle whenever they feel like, but then act like we are friends. So right now you have an agreement to sort of pull out the troops, but we don't know within the next 1 or 2 years that could change and something else would happen. China's strategy, mistakenly so, is to needle India so India would take its line. The challenge is China also has the Belt and Road Initiative, which is
Yes.
very different from the typical great power mode, except it has some similarities with East India companies. So, in some sense, India has not come up with a counter to that strategy, in particular in its immediate neighborhood and in the neighborhood beyond, near abroad, Southeast Asia. It has some success in the Persian Gulf region for economic reasons and Africa. And so it is a bit of a challenge because India's pocketbooks are not as big as China's. And secondly, India has a bit of a challenge that it doesn't follow through promised programs. For instance, the Northeastern Corridor to Southeast Asia. So if it only follows through some of these programs, it can really challenge China's economic strategy because even though it may not equalize it, but as you said, with Japan and Australia and the US as partners, it could definitely offer a counter to BRI. And that hasn't happened. The United States also has a problem. It is a very military dominated hegemonic power. In other words, it believes that its military is what it gives its dominance. Economic power is declining in a relative sense, where others are catching up. Although the mighty dollar still acts as a currency that allows it to have some control over the world, and the IMF and World Bank, the institutions that the Western countries dominate. So there are things that they could do, but my concern is that if China declines a little bit, will it start more military aggrandizement? And that the Southeast Asian countries, in particular, the Philippines and the Vietnam and all, have still number one trading partner with China, yet look at the territorial conflict that does not seem to be betting, and that is a challenge. And so it's a very tricky international order that's emerging.
Yeah.
And so here you need to navigate with a lot of craftiness and cleverness. India has been doing pretty well, I must say, the notion of
Mhm.
multi-alignment. And then you can't ignore Russia. The reason for that is if Russia joins an alliance with China, then you have a real bipolar competition. India does not want bipolarity, rightly so, because in a bipolar order, a third party may not have a lot of say in how the order is structured. And so India likes the idea of multiplicity, multiplex, multipolarities. I don't know what terms they use. Clearly, they are
Mhm.
comfortable in a world order where India has a say too. Okay, but that say will increase only if it puts its domestic conditions in order. And I argue, I think, in the book that India's biggest challenge
Yeah.
is this whole inability to use is demographic dividend and the human development very skewed. So this is what most unequal rising power in history, I would argue.
Mhm. So you can say that despite the demographic dividend, uh, now that India has become the most populous country of the world, it's not really going to be so easy, and India is perhaps not able to capitalize on that demographic dividend.
Very much so. Part of it is a fleeting dividend, isn't it? So another 20, 30 years, it will be gone. And secondly, this population that is the youth bulge is called is not benefiting from this economic growth, or manufacturing is very low level. And the fact that you have upper middle class or middle class with some possibilities are basically going abroad, which means there is a brain drain. And whether they come back, hard to know. Some of them probably do. And so India has to develop a strategy to make use of its population, its core strength, that's the youth. And for that, India has not developed a strategy yet. And secondly, the Human Development Index, India is 132 out of 189 countries or something, and that is very low, And this is not changing partly because India has not put enough money on education, healthcare, and infrastructure. I'm not talking about the big ticket infrastructure, rural
Mm.
infrastructure to urban planning to whatnot. So India's look is very much a developing country, and it's very difficult to pull out unless planners have a strategy to show that your cities are livable, you have a quality of life. Every rising power in the past invested in those dimensions. You can talk of Peter the Great, Bismarck, thinking of the welfare state in Germany, despite being a very conservative right-wing man, for the reasons that the soldier has to be educated and fed. Then Meiji Restoration, internal capacity building. So India has this economic growth, which gives it a GDP, but per capita income is very low. And it's a very
Right.
skewed development. Some areas it has done very well. And then finally, I would argue that India is not putting enough into new technologies such as AI. And it's not
Right.
developing these technologies, unlike China. So China is an interesting model. I mean, look at the internal development they did, infrastructure and the poverty removal as part of its rise. Okay, so it doesn't
Mm.
percolate into the Indian mind yet,
Mm.
except
Mm.
that we want to be a Vikasit country, Rajin, by 2047. It
Mm.
remains a slogan. I'm sorry to say you are not showing evidence of real activities in your
Absolutely. Yeah.
public domain. You see, that is what is missing compared to China.
Right. So you would say that this lack of inclusive economic development is something that is also one of the factors hindering the rise of India as a leading global power. And if at all, if it can address this, all these what you call the domestic challenges, that perhaps can strengthen its position in the international arena, despite the fact that the GDP is not as high as you mentioned somewhere towards the end of the book, that the world powers are not really those countries which have actually sorted out everything at the domestic front. They continue to have problems like the US does,
Yeah.
and yet they're world powers.
Yeah. So I think the one should understand that the established powers that God recognized in the past, including Russia, for instance, have institutional membership. It's not going to be taken out of them. So even Britain, it lost a lot of its status. So it's the trouble for a newcomer to enter with attributes that people will look at it immediately. Who are your immediate peer competitor, China, and then people can say what it's doing. The second thing is India contributing to the global economy and global economic processes more than just the GDP. What size is India's trade? What size is India's stock market? Yes, it's growing. I'm not saying that. What impact it will have on the global economy if tomorrow there is a major crisis? And can India play? In fact, it did in the 2008 2009 financial crisis. Prime Minister Manmohan Singh and team, along with the BRICS, played a big role. Can it play something like that? And the big challenge here is Mr. Trump is unpredictable. He could come up with all these ideas that may prevent the BRICS mechanism, for instance. So at that
Right.
time, what is their strategy? Can India avoid that partnership with BRICS? And actually, that is one reason by which China is befriending India today, is because they want India to be on board to prevent the
Mm.
Trump's use of weaponized interdependence, as they call it.
Right.
So, what kind of strategy India will have, avoiding a friction with the West or United States, not the West, United States, and
Mhm.
what will contribute to the maintenance of BRICS, that mechanism. So it's a very delicate task. But I would say that diplomatic achievements are possible. There are talks of a UN Security Council expansion. The big challenge is there won't be a veto power. because none of the developing countries, even the so-called friends of India, want India, any country, to have a veto power. Second
Hmm.
ranking states today have what you call more agency. They're not interested to see another hierarchy, another set of countries, even if they are valuable to them. So that's because of globalization, because nationalism. And then, of course, in South Asia, I look at, China has entered the region in a big way. That India is what I call co-sharing status
Yeah.
in South Asia, which was not the case before. China largely ignored South Asia except Pakistan. So that's sort of a diplomatic
So we,
challenge. But mm,
hmm.
it has it made some achievements, and it's not pushing as hard as making these statements. The other challenge is it's very useful electorally for whoever has this capacity to show that they are bringing India to the forefront. Here, I think Mr. Modi has done well for his own party and himself, and the middle
Right.
class somehow believing that he has made it all possible, despite the fact that without Narasimha Rao and Manmohan Singh in particular,
Hmm.
liberalizing India and pulling out some 300 million people out of lower middle class or up, lower poverty to some middle class level.
Right.
And that the current regime has really expanded some of that. But the Congress party is not very good in propagandizing these
Hmm.
achievements. And even today, I read the Rahul Gandhi statements.
Right.
Unfortunately, they are not using any of these language of India should
Yeah.
be a major power or Vigasit country. They are still in another Nehruvian paradigm or socialist
Hmm.
world, which may help them in some pockets, but Indian middle class is aspiring a lot more. Okay,
Right.
this is very critical to think about. And the Congress Party's inability to, this is something new. The more I read about of what the
Hmm.
Congress Party's inability to even use the word that India should be a lead player in the world order. What will the
Right.
Congress Party do differently from
Hmm.
BJP? I think they need to work on that because that's a big
Right.
vote catcher too, isn't it?
Right, right, absolutely, Mr. Paul. I mean, you're right about the fact that Mr. Modi has been able to galvanize his party and the cadre, and it has, of course, helped him reap that political dividend and stay in power for the last nearly 15 years now, the third term now. But there are also questions about, for instance, minority rights or political freedom, or questions about freedom to speech and expression. And do you see India more preoccupied with these concerns rather than acquiring perhaps a seat at the at the world table, and for instance pursuing more vigorously a permanent seat at the United Nations Security
So,
Council?
if you look at my discussion of the comprehensive national power, I
Right.
argue that soft power that gave India the importance, whatever importance it had, was its what you call Indian exceptionalism, democracy, secularism, federalism, three language formula, and
Right.
integrating this diverse country into a somewhat peacefully. Of course, there are occasional violence here and there and some secessionist movements, but overall, it has been a success story. Think about Africa being united into one. The
Mm.
population size of Africa, I believe, is almost the size, or actually lower than India's.
Right.
So this is a major achievement, but the mistake is to believe that the rest of the world will like us even if we do some of the abandonment of these so-called liberal principles,
Mhm.
because our religious identity will give us a boost. I haven't seen any evidence of that, unfortunately. If you look
Mhm.
around, which country respects India for its religious nationalism? What is respected is its diversity, its secularism, and its democracy. So,
Right.
electorally, it makes sense for the BJP to play this, but there's a lot of misperception as to what counts in the counts of the world. And secondly, how do other countries emulate you? So
Mhm.
emulation is big part of a great power. Others want your system, your political order. The liberal ideology is what attracted to the Americans. Despite the fact that they have often broke that liberal principles and engage in extreme violence. The
Mhm.
communism is what attracted to Soviet Union.
Yeah.
Now, I am not sure the Hindutva as an ideology can really attract many
Mhm.
outsiders. Internally, yes. So there is a
Yeah.
mismatch between internal discourse and external achievements. But one other thing I would argue, it's in India's interest to make use of its minorities as well as its Dalits, especially the 30% to
Mhm.
40% of population, including the Muslims, part of this economic development story. Imagine if
Right.
they are also big active participants and their education level goes up and they are big players. India's GDP will grow, India's per capita income grow. India could overtake the United States one day, which they're saying will happen. But even then, it is going to be a challenge if we have this extreme poverty and extreme inequalities. So the
Right.
inequality is accentuated by this minority challenge to minority rights and not giving them the kind of education and human development. I would
Mhm.
include also women.
Right.
In demographic challenge is not just these minorities and Dalits or other weaker sections. It's
Mhm.
also that it's not used women, and those
Mhm.
states that have used women have done very well in many ways. No, and human quality of life is also increasing in those places where women
Right.
and children are playing a role.
Mhm. But do you see this vision and the political leadership and political willingness coming to the fore? When it comes to this quest to be a world power. Yeah.
At the top political level,
Yes.
central government level, the elite is talking. But when you
Yeah.
go down to the bureaucracy, the state capitals, the state
Mhm.
bureaucracy, the second tier political elite, second tier bureaucratic elite, all the way to the village panchayat, you don't
Mhm.
get that sense. Okay,
Right.
this is a mostly slogan. That's the difference with China. I was told that the Communist Party elite from
Mhm.
the top encourages the lower level. China's
Right.
rise is very important to you and us. Your
Mhm.
role is to help that process. For that, you have to move your infrastructure, you have to develop your cities, remove poverty. You don't see that in India unless somebody can tell me that's not the case. So this
Right.
rise is purely a symbolic thing. Although I think the top elite really wants to get there,
Mhm.
it hasn't percolated. And then the middle class has this notion that it is getting some respect, of course. Mr. Modi goes around and gets quite a bit of appreciation in different capitals. But how
Mhm.
to sustain it, how to legitimize it, these questions don't seem to occur. And when a
Right.
bureaucrat sits over a file and or gets corrupted or gain bribe for any infrastructure projects, he
Right.
or she is hurting India's chance to become a great power. Okay,
Right.
this is, and that has to be communicated to them
Mhm.
that your narrow interest is hurting India's interest. And you look
Right.
at China or other countries where this vision of a country playing a role. I mean, this is one thing about the United States. The Americans
Mhm.
have this notion of uh, make America great again is not just confined, by the way, to Trump. It's also
Yeah.
liberal aspiration that they want to be the dominant power.
Mhm.
Doesn't mean that they have done a great job in their certain areas they have failed, but it's
Yeah.
still very needed if you want to be an important player. Your population has to work for it,
Yeah.
and I
Yeah.
think that
And in
would
India's case, you don't see the population working for it. Do you?
I
Would you
would
say that?
say that not working sufficiently. I mean, maybe there are
Right. Right.
people, but they don't
Okay.
consider there's no relationship to their performance to the country's advancement as a status builder.
Right. You talk in detail about the external factors, as it were, for India's lagging behind in the global influence that way. But you also write, I think, somewhere in the introduction itself, that the lack of global economic prominence is also India's own making. Uh, why would you say that?
See, look at the spending on education from independence.
Right.
2% of the GDP, 1% to the IITs and IIMs and the Indian Institute of Science and the upper level education. 1% to the rest. Is that enough to make this country educational power? And today also it's around 3%, I believe. Of course, some states are also spending a lot more in some. But you need a developmental states of East Asia spend about 6 to 7%, now 8% to education, some cases.
Right.
Same number to healthcare, same number to infrastructure. India has neglected all the three. Infrastructure is getting a little bit more now. Healthcare is actually going down.
Yeah.
So this idea that a consequential economic development with the people benefiting from it seem to have missed even Nehruvian days. And
Yeah.
that's big challenge because you compare that with the East Asian miracle states. Korea was a poorer than India, by the way, when it 1950. And where it stands today because they put money into where it matters. The Indian
Right.
political system does not encourage politicians to put money into these long term projects. They are going for short term achievements to show that, or symbolic achievements or slogans.
Right.
So there is a big challenge there, disparity between what is spent on the core areas where a country's strength lies. That is its populations, education, quality education, skill development,
Right.
as well as the healthcare and infrastructure
Right.
development.
Mr. Paul, what does the future hold? I mean, there is a chapter called The Future, and in which you make a case for, and it's titled Why India Deserves a Place Among the Major Powers. And you go on to enumerate a lot of reasons, including stuff like, grievance prevention, utilitarianism, global governance, and how great powers need not fully, and as I mentioned earlier, need not fully, solve their domestic problems. Now, uh, the question is, where do you see India going from here? I mean, there are so many contradictions on the domestic front. There are so many battles to be won. And as you said, concerns over employment, concerns over education, all these metrics that are really alarming, and including the hunger index, and all the other indices where India is constantly has been falling on most of the major fronts. What hope do you have, and what do you see, India going from here? As far
Well,
as Go ahead.
some believe that GDP growth rate is the big matrix. It will bring India the glory. And in fact, I was confronted in Delhi with that argument by some prominent journalists. And I
Right.
said that that's the problem. You believe in GDP, but it's one indicator, and you need a lot more for comprehensive national power. So this book is arguing that India deserves the place, one-fifth of humanity. And when you think about global governance without India, it's impossible to picture it. And more than that, India's place is needed for its own development and a sense of worth, sense of being an important player in the world order is very important for India as a long-lasting civilizational state. But the Indian strategy has been on global governance issues, what you call veto player, whether it
Right.
is climate change or trade. It gives a short-term power, but it doesn't solve the problem of climate change or anything of that. So India has a strategy that needs more pivoting to ideas to change the world order. Of course, the use of global south as a platform is interesting, but how many others are interested in India in playing the game as it did in the Bantung or non-aligned movement? Because India wants to have a foot in the global south and in the big club, so it's a challenge. So the internal challenges are likely to, my argument is that it reduces India's possibilities, but that should not be the reason for India not to be in clubs where decisions are made. Those decisions affect India and Indians. Okay, so in
Right.
really in its own interest and in the interest of other partners that India is there. You cannot solve the climate change problem, climate crisis without India's participation. So here I think it's a two-way process. And secondly, global governance no longer is viewed as a top-down thing. It's a democratic. So if you're talking about democratic governance, you need India. Is India prepared for it? Well, that's the question we just discussed. It has a
Right.
long way to go. It's
Yeah.
unfinished, but it is likely to get there as sometimes countries reach certain pivotal points where reforms can happen. Okay,
Right.
transitions
Right.
can happen. But the challenge is as long as the current uh, situation does not lead to national
Hmm.
disintegration or major crises in the past,
Right.
religious crises, groups fighting each other, or this permanent underclass
Yeah.
coming from various policies. So the current regime has a long needs to
Go ahead.
understand what it takes India. They really want India to be a forefront. Is it going
Yeah.
to be their parameters that are most important? What else is needed? For that, they need to work on. They need to engage people with ideas. There is a tendency to close the shop. We don't want to talk to anybody. You just accept what we are. But it's good to engage. Why is it so defensiveness to talk to scholars, journalists, and not even allowing them to visit India? I mean, this is a very strategic mistake. So India's rise is, I argue, is very important, and in fact, I support that. It shouldn't be treated as a subaltern power anymore. It really needs to be in the forefront. But in
Right.
India, that is inclusive, that is developmental oriented, and that also can contribute to global order in different ways.
Absolutely. Mr. Paul, one last question, and then we wind up the interview. There has been a lot of debate, in recent years, between, debate over the model that Jawaharlal Nehru championed, for instance, the Nehruvian socialism, and on the other hand, you have Mr. Modi's vision of an India which is perhaps not so inclusive, and also not, a country that does not really guarantee that kind of social justice. I wanted your comments on, do you see today India more positioned to sort of pursue this dream more vigorously than perhaps it would have been possible for somebody like Mr. Nehru? Or what kind of approach is needed more today than, that's going to work more, perhaps effectively?
Well, I'm a big fan of Nehru. I should say that without Nehru, India would not have a parliamentary democracy because Nehru truly believed in democracy. He went to the parliament, sat there, listening to these crappy speeches by local politicians often. And
Yeah.
he was, but his economic model was what at that time
Hmm.
people thought would work. He
Yeah.
took a lot of ideas from the Soviet planned economic model. And then he basically killed the capitalist class to emerge because 70% of economic activity is state driven. And he also had this British era idea of the bureaucracy is so important, big players. Indian bureaucracy in general has been not very developmental oriented. They're very status conscious, by the way, as you know very well. IAS, IFS means a lot in the Indian class caste society. So the Nehruvian ideas were very important to pull India together, but I have blamed the successors to Nehru, including Indira Gandhi, not to
Hmm.
liberalize at the right moment.
Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah.
Even Rajiv Gandhi took a while. I mean, he did a few things. So when China was doing it, somehow India should have started 10 years or 20 years before that.
Nearly a
And
decade before.
yeah, and Indira Gandhi also maintained this very socialist. Again, she was also using populism and propaganda. So it's not a, I wouldn't put Nehru the fault for mistakes that was done. When you realize that that model won't work, India took a long time to figure that out. That too, at the end of the Cold War and a crisis induced by the economic crisis of 1991. Without that crisis, India would still be not liberalized. So India is a reactive state. And so that one part. And secondly, Nehru's ideas, um, even if he didn't have a lot of influence after in the some areas, but he played a big role with soft power alone. Think of the impact India had in the 50s. So the challenge was when you have the Chinese attack took place, that soft power crumbled down because that couldn't withstand, deter, or defend against China. And then Nehru himself collapsed, if you think about his death coming out
Right.
as a result of that setback. So that humiliation is still there. But the current regime is throwing away all that idea is not going to bring great glory because India could face internal challenges if, especially the north-south divide is worrisome if you think about population demographic changes. And if the northern states have a disproportionate governance role,
Yeah.
southerners feel very disenchanted, and disenchantments are often precursors to, Indian history shows Indian
Yeah.
unity. Last time was Aurangzeb, by the way, who maintained India together for a short period. And before that, India was not as united. Of course, there are Mauryas and Guptas, but that's a long time back.
Yeah.
The British could even have joined the entire thing. They had British provinces, and then they had the princely states. So these all states and regions have to feel part of this country's administrative system governance, benefiting from it. So grievance should not fester to in a point where things could go wrong. If they can maintain growth, equity, and not to push hard anti-minority programs and the north-south divide, no, I just meant a little bit in economic terms and demographic terms, India has a long way to go. It will achieve some of its goals. It is a
Right.
united market. It's the European Union without many barriers in between. So a lot of things can be achieved.
Right. On that note, Mr. Paul, thank you so much indeed for joining me. It was such a stimulating conversation, and there is a great deal to learn from whatever you
Yeah.
have said
You,
about
I know you
the role of
50
India.
minutes, which is a good sign.